Katie Fusco had always wondered about her biological parents. Growing up in Dover, New York, with her adoptive parents, Anthony and Kelly Fusco, she was loved deeply. But there was always a gnawing curiosity, a hole that needed to be filled. So, at 18, she decided to find them. Henrico County, Virginia, greeted Katie with its serene suburban charm when she arrived at the doorstep of Steven and Alyssa Pladl. Her hands trembled slightly as the door opened, revealing Steven, her biological father. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a smile that seemed warm, yet oddly intense. Alyssa stood beside him, petite and reserved, her eyes scanning Katie like she was seeing a long-lost piece of herself. "Welcome home," Steven said, his voice carrying a strange mixture of authority and relief. Katie stepped inside cautiously, greeted by the laughter of two younger children, her half-siblings, chasing each other through the living room. For a moment it felt surreal, like the puzzle of her life was finally coming together. Dinner that evening was filled with stories. Alyssa recounted the difficult decision to give Katie up for adoption, explaining through tears how it was the only way to ensure she had a better life. Steven listened quietly, his eyes rarely leaving Katie's face. She noticed, but dismissed it as fatherly affection. Anthony and Kelly had warned her about romanticizing the reunion, but in that moment, it felt like a dream come true. As the days passed, Katie began settling into her new reality. She learned that Steven was an artist working from home, his sketches covering the walls of his studio. The drawings were haunting, faces frozen in expressions of anguish, shadowy forests stretching endlessly. Katie was both captivated and unnerved by his work. Alyssa, on the other hand, was warm but distant, as if something weighed heavily on her. Conversations with her often felt strained, though Katie couldn't understand why. The house, though lively, seemed to carry an unspoken tension. One night, Katie woke to the sound of muffled arguing. Peeking from her room, she saw Alyssa and Steven in the kitchen. Alyssa's voice was sharp, her words unintelligible, but her tone conveyed frustration. Steven, however, remained calm, his expression unreadable. The argument ended abruptly when Alyssa stormed upstairs, leaving Steven standing alone in the dim kitchen light. The next morning, Alyssa's mood had shifted. Over breakfast, she suggested taking Katie out for a mother-daughter day. They strolled through a local park, where Alyssa finally spoke candidly. "Steven and we've had our struggles," she admitted, staring at the distant horizon. "But you've brought something back to him. I see it. And I hope it's for the better." Katie didn't fully grasp Alyssa's meaning, but her words left an imprint. She felt like an anchor had been dropped into her life, one tethered to something deeper than she could yet comprehend. Back at the house, Steven was in his studio, sketching intently. Katie wandered in, drawn by curiosity. He looked up, his face lighting up with a smile that felt too familiar, too intimate. "I was just working on something for you," he said, sliding a sketch across the desk. The drawing was of Katie, but not as she saw herself. In it, her eyes were larger, more haunted, and her expression carried a mix of longing and sadness. She didn't know what to say. "You inspire me," Steven added softly, his voice low. The words lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. Katie left the room, uneasy but unsure why. She didn't know then that this moment was the first thread in a web of events that would unravel her life completely. Katie's first week with the Pladl family felt like walking through a delicate balance. Each moment seemed calm on the surface, yet beneath it there was a weight, something unspoken, lingering in the shadows. Alyssa grew quieter with each passing day. Her once tentative warmth toward Katie seemed to cool into distant politeness. Over dinner one evening, Alyssa's eyes darted between Katie and Steven, who was unusually cheerful, recounting a story from his past. When Steven made a comment about how much Katie reminded him of her mother in her younger years, Alyssa's fork clattered against her plate. She muttered an apology, but didn't join the conversation again that night. The tension only grew the following day. Katie overheard a hushed phone call as she walked past Alyssa's bedroom. Peering through the slightly ajar door, she caught snippets of Alyssa's trembling voice. "I'm trying, but I don't know. Something doesn't feel right." A pause. "It's like he's obsessed. No, I haven't talked to her about it yet." Katie didn't stay long enough to hear more, but those words stayed with her, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. That evening, Katie was sitting on the couch with her half-siblings when Steven entered the room holding a set of sketchbooks. He had a proud, almost boyish grin. "Katie, "I've been working on some pieces inspired by you," he said, gesturing for her to follow him to his studio. Inside, the room was filled with sketches, some incomplete, others fully realized. There were portraits of Katie in various poses, all with a hauntingly intense detail. One showed her sitting beneath a tree, her face turned toward the sky with an expression of longing. Another portrayed her looking directly out of the page, her eyes so vivid it felt as if they were watching her. Katie managed a weak smile. "These are beautiful. But why so many of me?" Steven shrugged, his grin unwavering. "You're my muse now. You've brought something back into my life I didn't realize I'd lost." The words felt off, but Katie didn't know how to respond. She muttered a quiet, "Thank you," and quickly excused herself. Alyssa's unease reached its breaking point 2 days later. That morning, as Katie came downstairs, she found Alyssa standing in the kitchen, her arms crossed and her expression stern. Steven leaned against the counter, his jaw clenched, a rare crack in his usually calm demeanor. "I can't do this anymore, Steven," Alyssa said, her voice sharp but trembling. "Whatever this is, it's not normal. It's not okay." Steven's eyes flicked toward Katie, softening instantly as he motioned for her to leave. "Katie, this doesn't concern you." But Alyssa wouldn't let it go. "She needs to know. She's not a child anymore. She deserves to understand what's happening." Katie froze, unsure of what to do. Her instinct told her to leave the room, but her feet refused to move. Steven's tone shifted, turning cold. "You're overreacting, Alyssa. You've been paranoid ever since she got here." "I'm not paranoid," Alyssa snapped, her voice cracking. "You're obsessed with her, Steven. And if you think I'm going to sit here and watch this happen, you're out of your mind." The room fell into an unbearable silence. Katie could feel the air grow heavier with each passing second. Steven's gaze darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line before he finally turned and walked away. Katie remained rooted in place, her mind racing. She turned to Alyssa, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did you mean by that? Why would you say he's obsessed?" Alyssa hesitated, tears pooling in her eyes. "You don't see it yet, Katie, but you will. Please, just be careful." Katie's world, which had begun to feel like it was falling into place, suddenly felt like it was tilting dangerously. The lines between family and something far darker were beginning to blur, though she didn't yet know how deeply. The tension in the Pladl household had grown unbearable, and Katie found herself in the center of a storm she couldn't fully comprehend. Alyssa's cryptic warnings lingered in her mind, but Steven's charm continued to pull her back in, leaving her caught between doubt and trust. It was late one evening when the boundary between father and daughter was irreparably crossed. Katie had been in the living room flipping through a book when Steven entered, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He sat beside her on the couch, closer than usual, his presence imposing yet oddly comforting. "You seem distant lately," Steven said, his voice soft but probing. "Are you all right?" Katie hesitated, unsure how to respond. She'd been feeling a growing unease around him, but voicing it felt impossible. "I'm fine," she murmured, though her tone betrayed her uncertainty. Steven studied her face for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to lie to me, Katie. You can tell me anything." The words hung in the air, heavy with an intimacy that felt out of place. Katie shifted uncomfortably, her fingers gripping the edge of the book. "It's just, everything's been a lot to process," she admitted. "This whole reunion, it's not what I expected." Steven leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I know, but you've brought something into my life that I never thought I'd have again." Katie froze, unsure of what he meant. Before she could respond, Steven placed a hand on hers. His touch, meant to be reassuring, felt anything but. "You don't see it yet," he continued, his eyes locking onto hers. "But you've changed everything for me. You've made me feel alive again." Katie pulled her hand away, her heart pounding. "Steven, you're my father," she said, her voice trembling. The words seemed to jar him, if only briefly. But he recovered quickly, his tone unwavering. "Family's more than blood, Katie. Sometimes it's about connection. And what we have, it's special." Katie stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I think I need some air," she said, her words rushed. Steven didn't stop her as she hurried outside, but she could feel his gaze following her. The cool night air hit her face like a slap, grounding her in a reality she wasn't ready to face. She paced the front yard, replaying the conversation in her mind. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. The next morning, the house was silent. Alyssa had taken the younger children to school, leaving Katie and Steven alone. Katie avoided him as best she could, but Steven was persistent. You don't need to be afraid of me, he said, blocking her path in the hallway. His tone was calm, almost soothing, but his eyes betrayed a desperation that unsettled her. I'm not afraid, Katie lied, stepping around him. I need time to think. Stephen grabbed her wrist, not forcefully but firmly enough to make her stop. Don't push me away, Katie, he said, his voice low. I don't think I could handle that. Katie yanked her arm free, her heart racing. She retreated to her room, locking the door behind her. For the first time, she felt a genuine fear of the man who was supposed to be her father. That evening, Alyssa returned home earlier than expected. She found Stephen in his studio, pacing back and forth with a frantic energy. His sketches were scattered across the floor, many of them featuring Katie's face in haunting detail. What are you doing? Alyssa demanded, her voice sharp. Stephen didn't answer immediately. When he finally looked at her, his expression was one of defiance. You don't understand, Alyssa. She's different. She's not like anyone else. She's your daughter! Alyssa's voice cracked with anger and disbelief. Do you even hear yourself? Stephen's gaze darkened, his jaw tightening. You've always tried to control me, but this is something you'll never understand. Alyssa stormed out of the studio, slamming the door behind her. She found Katie in the kitchen, her face pale and her hands trembling as she sipped a glass of water. We need to talk, Alyssa said, her voice softer now. Katie, I think you need to leave. Katie looked up, her eyes wide with confusion. What? Why? It's not safe here, Alyssa replied, glancing toward the studio door. I don't know what's going on with him, but I can't protect you if you stay. Katie's stomach churned. She didn't want to believe Alyssa, but the fear in her voice was undeniable. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind raced with thoughts of escape. She didn't know where she would go or what she would do, but one thing was clear, this house was no longer her safe haven. The days that followed Alyssa's warning passed like a blur. Katie found herself avoiding both Alyssa and Stephen, retreating into her room or taking long walks outside to clear her mind. The house felt like it was closing in on her, every interaction laced with an unspoken tension that she couldn't shake. One afternoon, Stephen knocked on her door, his tone unusually soft. Katie, can we talk? Just for a moment. Katie hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Against her better judgment, she opened it, finding Stephen standing there with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. I know things have been tense, he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. But I need you to understand something. What we have, it's not wrong. It's different, but not wrong. Katie froze, her mind racing. What are you talking about? Stephen stepped closer, his voice lowering. You've felt it too, haven't you? This connection between us. It's stronger than anything I've ever known. She took a step back, her heart pounding. You're my father, Stephen. This isn't normal. Stephen's eyes flashed with frustration, but he quickly softened his tone. Katie, labels like father or daughter, they're just words. What matters is how we feel, what we mean to each other. Katie shook her head, her voice trembling. You're wrong. This isn't right. Stephen reached out, his hand brushing her shoulder. Katie, I love you. More than anything. And I think you love me too. The words hit her like a blow. She pushed past him, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she fled the room. She didn't stop running until she was outside, the crisp autumn air burning her lungs. She leaned against a tree, trying to steady herself. That evening, Alyssa confronted Stephen in the kitchen. The argument escalated quickly, their voices cutting through the stillness of the house. She's not safe here, Alyssa said, her tone fierce. You're not safe for her. Stephen's voice was cold, calculated. You don't understand, Alyssa. You never did. Katie is different. She gets me. She's a child, Alyssa snapped, slamming her hand on the counter. And if you think I'm going to let you ruin her life, you're even more delusional than I thought. Stephen's expression darkened, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice. She's not leaving. I won't let you take her away from me. Katie, listening from the top of the stairs, felt a chill run down her spine. She backed away, retreating to her room and locking the door. Her mind raced with thoughts of escape, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Stephen would find her no matter where she went. The following day, Alyssa packed her bags. She kissed Katie on the forehead, her eyes filled with sorrow. I'll come back for you, she whispered. I promise. Stephen watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. As Alyssa walked out the door, Katie felt a pang of fear. She was now alone with him. That night, Stephen knocked on her door again. She didn't answer, but he lingered outside, speaking softly through the wood. Katie, I know you're scared, but you don't need to be. I'll protect you, always. Katie sat on the edge of her bed, tears streaming down her face. She felt trapped, her world collapsing under the weight of a bond she never asked for. Katie sat in the dimly lit living room, her hands trembling as she clutched the pregnancy test. The two faint lines stared back at her like an accusation, their meaning undeniable. Her mind reeled as she tried to process the reality. She was carrying Steven's child. Tears blurred her vision. She didn't know whether to cry, scream, or simply run. But where could she go? She was trapped, bound by a relationship that had twisted every sense of normalcy she once knew. Steven entered the room quietly, his presence commanding even in the stillness. He noticed the test in her hands before she had a chance to hide it. "Katie." His voice was soft, filled with an unsettling mix of awe and satisfaction. Katie couldn't bring herself to look at him. This isn't right," she whispered, her voice breaking. Steven knelt in front of her, his hands gently gripping hers. "No, Katie. This is a gift. It's proof of what we have, something no one else will ever understand." Katie yanked her hands away, a surge of anger rising within her. "Do you even hear yourself? This isn't love, Steven. It's a nightmare." Steven's expression hardened for a moment, but then he softened, his tone soothing. "You're scared, I understand, but this child is ours. And I will do whatever it takes to protect you, to protect both of you." The weight of his words crushed her. She wanted to believe there was a way out, but Steven's possessive hold on her life felt unbreakable. Days turned into weeks, and Steven's behavior became even more controlling. He rarely let her leave the house, insisting it was for her safety. When Alyssa called to check on her, Steven answered, his tone curt and dismissive. "Katie's fine," he said, his words clipped. "She doesn't need your interference." Katie overheard the call and felt a flicker of hope when Alyssa insisted on speaking with her. "Katie," Alyssa said, her voice urgent, "please come with me. You don't have to stay there. You don't have to do this." Before Katie could respond, Steven yanked the phone from her hand. "Stay out of our lives," he growled, slamming the phone down. That night, Katie lay awake, her mind racing. She placed a hand on her stomach, a mixture of fear and guilt swirling within her. The life growing inside her was innocent, yet it was a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong. She didn't know if she could bring this child into the world under such circumstances. One evening, Steven announced that they would be moving to another state. "We need a fresh start," he said, his tone firm, "away from all the judgment. It'll be better for all of us." Katie didn't argue. She didn't have the energy to fight anymore. Steven's grip on her life was suffocating, and every attempt to resist seemed futile. As they packed their belongings, a knock at the door startled them. Steven stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he motioned for Katie to stay back. When he opened the door, a police officer stood on the porch. "Steven Pladl?" the officer asked. "We need to ask you a few questions." Steven's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Of course, how can I help?" Katie watched from the hallway, her heart pounding. She couldn't hear what was being said, but she saw the tension in Steven's body as the conversation unfolded. After a few minutes, the officer left, but Steven's mood darkened. He slammed the door shut, his fists clenched. "We're leaving tonight," he announced, his tone cold and final. Katie felt a surge of panic. "What's going on? Why are the police here?" Steven glared at her, his eyes blazing with anger. "Someone's been talking. It doesn't matter. They won't stop us." Katie's fear deepened as she realized how far Steven was willing to go to keep her under his control. That night, as they drove away from the only home she had ever known, Katie felt the weight of her reality sink in. She wasn't just running from the authorities or her past. She was running from herself, from the choices she had made, and from the life she had allowed Steven to create for her. Katie sat motionless in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly over her stomach. The night outside was pitch black, broken only by the glow of passing headlights. Steven had been driving for hours, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. His silence was suffocating. "We'll be safe soon," Steven finally said, his voice low but firm. "No one will separate us." Katie didn't respond. Her thoughts churned as she stared out the window, watching shadows stretch across the empty highway. Every fiber of her being wanted to scream, to jump out of the car, to escape the man who had twisted her world into something unrecognizable. Hours later, they arrived at a small motel on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia. Steven parked the car and handed Katie the keys to their room. "Go ahead," he instructed. "I need to make a call." Katie hesitated, then nodded. She stepped into the cramped motel room and locked the door behind her, her heart racing. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling. She knew this was her moment, her chance to reach out for help, but fear paralyzed her. Minutes later, Steven entered the room, his expression unreadable. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. "They're watching us," he muttered, more to himself than to Katie. "They want to tear us apart." Katie stayed silent, but her stomach knotted. Steven's paranoia had been growing worse with each passing day. He jumped at the sound of every phone ringing, every knock at a door. The next morning, the sound of pounding on the door jolted Katie awake. Steven was already on his feet, his body tense as he opened it. Two police officers stood outside, their expressions grim. "Steven Pladl?" one of them asked. "Yes," Steven replied, his voice calm but his posture rigid. "We have a warrant for your arrest," the officer continued. "Step outside and put your hands behind your head." Katie watched in stunned silence as Steven complied, his movements slow and deliberate. Her heart pounded as one officer cuffed him while the other stepped inside. "Ma'am, are you Katie Pladl?" the officer asked. Katie nodded, her voice catching in her throat. "Yes. We need you to come with us," the officer said, his tone gentle but firm. Steven's voice cut through the tension. "Don't listen to them, Katie. They're lying. They don't understand us." Katie froze, her breath hitching as Steven's words echoed in her ears. The officers ushered her outside where another car waited. She glanced back, seeing Steven's face through the window of the squad car. His eyes burned with desperation. At the police station, Katie was questioned for hours. She recounted everything: the reunion with Steven, his growing possessiveness, the pregnancy. Every word felt like a betrayal, but she knew it was the only way to break free. Meanwhile, Steven remained silent, refusing to answer any questions. His lawyer arrived quickly, advising him not to speak without legal counsel present. The tension in the station was palpable. News of the arrest spread rapidly. Reporters swarmed the building, their cameras flashing as officers escorted Steven out in handcuffs. Alyssa, watching from home, felt a wave of relief mixed with anger. She had warned the authorities about Steven months ago. Why had it taken so long for them to act? Katie, seated in a small interrogation room, was handed a cup of water by a detective. "You did the right thing by talking to us," he said, his voice kind but firm. "You're not alone in this." Tears welled in Katie's eyes, but she nodded. For the first time in months, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. She was far from free, but the chains that bound her were starting to loosen. That night, as she sat in a temporary safe house, Katie stared out the window at the darkened street below. Steven's words replayed in her mind, haunting her. She knew the battle wasn't over. Steven wouldn't give up easily. And despite everything, a small part of her still felt tethered to him, unable to fully let go. Katie stared out the car window as the scenery blurred into a patchwork of fields and forests. She was heading back to her adoptive parents, Anthony and Kelly Fusco, after months of chaos that had unraveled her life. The relief of being free from Steven's grip was overshadowed by the weight of everything she had endured. When the car pulled into the driveway of her childhood home, Kelly rushed out, her arms wide open. Katie stepped out hesitantly, allowing herself to be enveloped in her mother's embrace. "You're safe now," Kelly whispered, her voice breaking. "You're home." Anthony appeared moments later, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. "We've been so worried about you, Katie," he said, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to face this alone." Inside the house, everything looked exactly as she remembered. Yet she felt like a stranger. Every familiar corner now seemed foreign, as if the person she had been before meeting Steven no longer existed. Her old bedroom had been preserved, untouched since the day she left, and Katie sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the quilt her mother had sewn years ago. The first few days passed quietly. Kelly hovered, always nearby but never prying. Anthony stayed close too, ensuring Katie felt secure. Despite their efforts, Katie struggled to adjust. Her nights were plagued by vivid nightmares. Steven's voice, his promises, his control. She would wake up gasping, her heart racing, and stare into the darkness until the first light of dawn. One morning, Kelly brought Katie a steaming cup of tea and sat beside her on the porch. "You've been through so much," Kelly said gently. "It's okay to feel lost." Katie stared into the distance. "I don't even know who I am anymore," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Everything feels wrong." Kelly reached over, squeezing Katie's hand. "You're stronger than you think, and we'll get through this together. But Katie's peace was short-lived. A few days later, a neighbor spotted a familiar figure lingering near the edge of the property. It was Steven. He had been released on bail and was wasting no time asserting his presence. Anthony called the police immediately, but Steven was gone by the time they arrived. The encounter left Katie shaken, her fragile sense of safety shattered. "He won't stop," she whispered that night as she sat at the kitchen table. "He'll never let me go." Anthony's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. "We'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. He doesn't control you anymore." Despite their reassurances, Katie's anxiety grew. She began noticing small signs that Steven might be watching. An unfamiliar car parked down the street, a shadow moving outside her window late at night. Whether real or imagined, the fear was suffocating. The breaking point came when a letter arrived in the mail. Katie opened it with trembling hands, her heart sinking as she recognized Steven's handwriting. Inside was a rambling message filled with declarations of love and veiled threats. "You can't escape us," it read. "We're meant to be together." Katie crumpled the letter in her hands, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this anymore," she sobbed. "I just want it to end." Kelly wrapped her arms around Katie, holding her tightly. "We'll find a way," she promised, her voice firm. "This ends now." That night, the family made a decision. They would push for a restraining order and work with the authorities to ensure Steven could no longer interfere in Katie's life. But deep down, Katie knew the battle was far from over. Steven's obsession ran too deep, and his determination to control her was unrelenting. As the days turned into weeks, Katie began to reclaim small pieces of herself. She joined her mother on walks through the neighborhood, rediscovering a semblance of normalcy. Yet the shadow of Steven loomed over every moment, a constant reminder of the danger that still lingered. The morning was crisp and quiet, the kind of day that seemed ordinary to anyone unaware of the storm brewing just out of sight. Katie was sitting at the kitchen table with Kelly, sipping tea and talking about mundane things. What to cook for dinner, whether they should plant flowers in the garden this spring. For a moment it felt almost normal, but that fragile peace was shattered by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Katie froze, her heart racing as she peered out the window. A dark sedan idled near the front porch, the driver obscured by the glare of the morning sun. "Stay here," Anthony said, his voice firm as he stepped toward the door. He'd been on edge for days, sensing that Steven was closer than any of them wanted to admit. Katie's instincts screamed at her to run, to hide, but she couldn't move. She watched as Anthony opened the door, his broad frame blocking her view. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm but cautious. There was no response. Instead, a figure stepped out of the car. Katie's blood ran cold as she recognized Steven. He was holding something. A glint of metal caught the light. A gun. "Anthony, get back!" Kelly screamed, lunging to grab Katie, pulling her away from the window. Chaos erupted as Steven raised the weapon, his face twisted with rage. "I told you she belongs with me," Steven shouted, his voice cracking. The shot rang out before anyone could react, a deafening explosion that seemed to freeze time. Anthony stumbled backward, clutching his chest as blood seeped through his shirt. "No!" Katie's scream was raw, piercing the air as she rushed toward the door, but Kelly held her back with surprising strength. "Run, Katie!" Kelly yelled, shoving her toward the back of the house. "Go! Now!" Katie stumbled, her legs barely able to carry her as she bolted through the back door and into the woods. Her mind was blank except for one thought: escape. The sound of footsteps crashing through the brush behind her told her Steven wasn't far behind. Her lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, weaving through the trees, her heart pounding like a drum. She could hear him calling her name, his voice a mix of fury and desperation. "Katie, stop! You can't run from me!" Suddenly she tripped, falling hard onto the forest floor. Pain shot through her ankle, but she bit back a cry, forcing herself to crawl behind a cluster of bushes. She pressed her hand over her mouth, trying to muffle her labored breathing as Steven's footsteps drew closer. "Katie," his voice was softer now, almost coaxing, "you know I'd never hurt you. Come back and we can fix this." Tears streamed down her face as she remained silent, praying he wouldn't find her. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours before his footsteps receded. Katie stayed hidden, her body trembling uncontrollably. When she finally dared to emerge, the woods were eerily silent. She stumbled back toward the house, her ankle throbbing with every step. As she approached, She saw the flashing lights of police cars and the chaos of officers surrounding the scene. Kelly ran to her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You're safe now," she whispered, though her voice wavered with grief. Katie's eyes searched for Anthony, but the sight of a stretcher being loaded into an ambulance told her everything she needed to know. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into Kelly's arms, her sobs shaking them both. Steven was nowhere to be seen. The officers assured her they were searching the area, but Katie knew him too well. He wasn't finished. This was only the beginning. The baby's cry echoed through the small house, piercing the silence that had settled after Steven fled. Katie sat on the worn couch, holding her son close to her chest, his tiny hands curled against her skin, a stark reminder of the life she had brought into the world amidst chaos. She wanted to believe they were safe now, but deep down, she knew Steven wouldn't stop. Police officers moved through the house, speaking in hushed tones as they processed the scene. Kelly sat nearby, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of untouched coffee. "They'll find him," she said softly, though her voice lacked conviction. Katie looked down at her son, tears filling her eyes. "I just want this to end," she whispered. "I want him out of our lives." Later that evening, the officers stationed a patrol car outside the house and reassured the family that they were protected. But Katie's unease lingered. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow outside the window sent her heart racing. As the hours passed, exhaustion took its toll. Katie placed the baby in his crib and sat beside him, watching his chest rise and fall with each tiny breath. She closed her eyes just for a moment, letting herself drift. She awoke to the sound of glass shattering. Her heart leapt into her throat as she grabbed her son and ran toward the hallway. Steven's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and unrelenting. "Katie!" he shouted. "You can't hide from me!" Katie's legs moved on instinct, carrying her toward the back door. She barely registered Kelly's screams from the living room as Steven's heavy footsteps followed her. She burst into the cool night air, clutching her son tightly as she ran toward the neighbor's house. But Steven was faster. He caught up to her near the edge of the property, grabbing her arm with a force that made her cry out. The baby wailed in her arms, his tiny voice pleading for a safety Katie couldn't provide. "Give him to me," Steven demanded, his eyes wild. "He's my son. He belongs with me." Katie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, you can't take him. You're insane, Steven. This has to stop." Steven's grip tightened, and for a moment Katie thought she might lose her balance. But before he could act, a voice rang out behind them. "Let her go!" It was one of the officers stationed nearby. His gun was drawn, his stance firm. "Steven Pladl, step away." Steven hesitated, his gaze darting between Katie and the officer. Katie took the opportunity to pull free, stumbling backward with her son as the officer approached. "You don't understand," Steven shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is my family. You can't take them from me." The officer didn't waver. "Drop the weapon and get on the ground," he commanded. Katie hadn't even noticed the knife in Steven's hand until that moment. Her breath caught in her throat as she backed further away, shielding her son. For a moment it seemed like Steven might comply. He lowered the knife slightly, his shoulders slumping, but then with a guttural scream, he lunged, not at Katie but at the officer. The next seconds unfolded in a blur. The officer fired, the sharp crack of the gunshot ringing out in the still night. Steven fell to the ground, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with shock. Katie turned away, holding her son tightly as tears streamed down her face. When the chaos finally subsided, the officers secured the scene, and an ambulance arrived to take Steven away. Katie sat on the neighbor's porch, her body trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. "He's gone," Kelly whispered, sitting beside her. "It's over." But Katie knew better. Steven might be gone, but the scars he left behind would remain. As she looked down at her son, she vowed to protect him from the shadow of his father, a shadow that would haunt them both for years to come. Steven sat slumped in the corner of the interrogation room, his hands cuffed behind his back. The room was cold and sterile, illuminated by a harsh overhead light that reflected off the metal table in front of him. He hadn't said a word since the officers dragged him in, his expression blank, his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall, as if lost in a trance. Detective Harris entered, a thick folder tucked under his arm. He placed it on the table with a deliberate thud, the sound breaking the silence. "Steven Pladl," Harris began, his voice steady but firm. "You know why you're here." Steven didn't respond. His chest rose and fell in slow, measured breaths, but his eyes never moved. Harris pulled out a photo from the folder and slid it across the table. It was of Katie, her face pale and tear-streaked from the night she escaped with her son. "She trusted you," Harris said, his tone growing sharper. "She believed you were her father, and look what you've done." For the first time, Steven's gaze shifted. His eyes landed on the photo, and his jaw tightened. "She's not just my daughter," he said, his voice low and trembling. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," Harris replied, leaning forward. "Help me understand why a man would betray his own child like this, why you've turned her life and the lives of everyone around her into a nightmare." Steven let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You see it as betrayal. I see it as love. Katie and I, we were meant to be together." Harris's expression hardened. "You call this love? Destroying her life? Putting your son in danger?" Steven's face darkened. "I didn't destroy anything. The world did. People like you judging us, trying to keep us apart. You don't know what we had, what we could have been." Harris leaned back, crossing his arms. "So what's your plan now, Steven? Katie doesn't want anything to do with you. She's finally free of you, and you're sitting here in handcuffs. What's next?" Steven's lips curled into a faint, almost sinister smile. "She'll come back," he said, his voice calm but chilling. "She always does. She belongs to me. That baby belongs to me." Harris stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're delusional," he snapped, slamming his hands on the table. "This ends here, Steven. You've taken enough. You've heard enough." Steven's smile faded, replaced by a cold, empty stare. "You think locking me up will stop this?" he murmured. "You think you've won?" The door opened, and another officer stepped in, signaling to Harris. "We've got what we need," the officer said. "He's not going anywhere." Harris turned back to Steven, his voice steady but sharp. "You're right about one thing, Steven. This is far from over. But the difference is you're done. And Katie? She's finally free." As the officers escorted Steven out, his expression remained unreadable. But as he passed the observation window, he glanced at Katie, who was standing behind the glass, her face pale but resolute. For the first time, Steven seemed shaken, his confident facade cracking under the weight of her unwavering stare. Katie turned away, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let Steven control her anymore. She was done being his victim. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional hum of cars passing through the outskirts of Dover, New York. Steven sat alone in the driver's seat of his car, parked on a desolate stretch of road near the edge of a wooded area. The darkness outside seemed to swallow the vehicle whole, mirroring the abyss inside him. In his hand, he held his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. After a long pause, he pressed the call button. The line rang twice before a weary voice answered. It was his mother. "Steven, where are you?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry and exhaustion. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared out the windshield, his breath fogging the glass. "It's over," he finally said, his voice hollow. "They've taken everything." His mother's voice cracked. "Steven, what are you talking about? You need to turn yourself in. Let this end before it gets worse." Steven let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head though no one could see. "It's already worse. It's been worse for a long time." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before his mother spoke again, her voice trembling. "You don't have to do this. Whatever you're thinking, it's not too late to stop." Steven gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "It's too late for everything. For Katie. For me. For all of it." In the distance, the faint sound of sirens grew louder, their wails cutting through the night air. Steven glanced in the rearview mirror, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting in his eyes. He knew they were coming for him. "I just wanted to protect her," he said softly, almost to himself. "But I ruined everything." His mother's voice broke through the haze of his thoughts. "Steven, please, just stop and talk to them. You can't undo what's been done, but you can make things right. You can still try." Steven closed his eyes, tears slipping down his face. He reached for the glove compartment, pulling out a handgun. The weight of it in his hands felt final, an inevitability he'd carried with him for weeks. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the phone, "for everything." "No!" his mother cried, her voice filled with panic. "Steven, don't!" The line went dead. Moments later, the officers arrived, their cars screeching to a halt behind his. They approached cautiously, weapons drawn, their voices amplified by megaphones. "Steven Pladl, step out of the vehicle with your hands where we can see them." There was no response, The officers exchanged glances, their movements careful as they advanced toward the car. One of them shined a flashlight through the driver's side window, illuminating Steven's lifeless body slumped over the steering wheel. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the upholstery. The scene became a blur of flashing lights and hushed radio chatter. One officer stepped back, shaking his head as he spoke into his radio. "Suspect is deceased. Self-inflicted gunshot wound." Nearby, Steven's mother arrived, her face pale and stricken as she was escorted by another officer. She collapsed to her knees at the sight of the car, her cries echoing into the stillness of the night. As the authorities processed the scene, the reality of Steven's actions and their consequences hung heavy in the air. For Katie, for her son, and for the families torn apart by his choices, this was the end of one chapter. But the scars left behind would remain for a lifetime. The morning after Steven Pladl's death, news outlets across the country lit up with headlines. "A family torn apart," one read, while another declared, "Father's obsession ends in tragedy." The shocking details of the case dominated every platform, from television screens to social media feeds. The nation was captivated, horrified, and divided. Katie, meanwhile, sat in the living room of her adoptive parents' home, staring blankly at the TV. The images on the screen blurred together. Photos of Steven, clips of reporters standing outside the crime scenes, and interviews with experts dissecting every aspect of the case. "This isn't your fault," Kelly said gently, sitting beside her. "You did everything you could." Katie nodded faintly, though her chest felt heavy. The world was watching, and no matter how much she wanted to disappear, she was at the center of it all. In the days that followed, public opinion became a storm of judgment and speculation. Some expressed sympathy for Katie, seeing her as a victim of Steven's manipulation. Others, however, were less forgiving, questioning how she could have let the relationship escalate. Social media was a breeding ground for opinions, many of them cruel. "She knew what she was doing," one comment read. "How do you not realize something like that is wrong?" Another countered, "She was groomed by her own father. How can anyone blame her for this?" Katie stopped reading after the first day. The words cut too deeply, each one feeling like another stone added to the weight she already carried. Kelly and Anthony did their best to shield her from the noise, but it was impossible to block it all out. The media's attention didn't stop at Katie. Alyssa, Steven's ex-wife and Katie's biological mother, found herself thrust into the spotlight as well. Reporters camped outside her home, shouting questions whenever she stepped outside. "How did you not see this coming?" one journalist asked. "Do you feel responsible for what happened?" pressed another. Alyssa refused to comment, her face tight with anger and grief. Inside her home, she paced the floor, her hands clenched into fists. "They're vultures," she muttered to herself, picking at the pieces of a tragedy. Experts weighed in on every channel, analyzing the psychological and legal implications of the case. Dr. Emily Lawson, a prominent psychologist, appeared on one program, her tone somber. "This is a textbook case of coercive control and emotional manipulation," she explained. Steven Pladl exploited his position as a father to exert dominance over Katie, creating a toxic dynamic that she couldn't escape. Law enforcement officials also faced scrutiny. Many questioned why it had taken so long for authorities to act, given Alyssa's initial reports about Steven and Katie's relationship. "There were systemic failures here," admitted one local official during a press conference. "We're conducting a full review to ensure something like this never happens again." For Katie, the scrutiny was suffocating. Everywhere she turned, her story was being dissected and debated by strangers who didn't know her or the pain she carried. She stopped leaving the house entirely, unable to face the prying eyes and whispered judgments. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kelly found Katie sitting on the porch, her face streaked with tears. "It's too much," Katie whispered. "Everyone has an opinion about me, about my life. They don't even know me." Kelly wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "They don't matter," she said firmly. "What matters is that you survived. You're here, Katie, and you're stronger than any of them will ever understand." Katie nodded, though the words felt distant. She wanted to believe them, to feel the strength Kelly saw in her. But the wounds Steven had left ran deep, and she wasn't sure they would ever truly heal. As the media frenzy began to die down, Katie resolved to take back some control of her life. She agreed to sit down with a therapist, someone who could help her navigate the trauma and find a way forward. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. Even as the world moved on to the next headline, Katie knew the shadow of her past would always follow her, but she also knew she had survived the worst of it. And maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to keep surviving. As the dust settled, the true scope of what had transpired came into sharper focus, not just as a personal tragedy, but as a failure of the very systems meant to protect the vulnerable. News outlets began to shift their focus from the sensational details of the Pladl family's collapse to the glaring questions that remained unanswered. "How did this happen?" a reporter asked during a primetime broadcast. "How did so many red flags go ignored?" In Henrico County, Virginia, Alyssa sat across from a local journalist, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had finally agreed to speak, not to relive the pain, but to highlight the failures that allowed Steven's actions to escalate unchecked. "I reported Steven months before this all spiraled out of control," Alyssa said, her voice steady but filled with underlying anger. "I told them about the relationship. I gave them evidence, and nothing was done." The reporter leaned forward. "Why do you think your warnings weren't taken seriously?" Alyssa hesitated, glancing down before meeting the journalist's gaze. "Because the system doesn't listen to women like me. They treated it like a family dispute instead of the serious crime it was. If they had acted when I first came forward, my daughter wouldn't have had to suffer the way she did." Her words echoed sentiments being shared by activists, legal experts, and the public. On talk shows and online forums, the story became a case study in systemic negligence. Advocates pointed out the glaring gaps, how initial police reports were brushed aside, how courts failed to act decisively, and how resources for victims of coercive control were woefully inadequate. At a press conference, Detective Harris, who had been involved in the case, faced a barrage of questions. "Why wasn't Steven Pladl arrested sooner?" one journalist demanded. "Why weren't Katie and her child better protected?" Harris's jaw tightened as he responded. "We acted on the evidence we had at the time. Hindsight shows where we could have done better, but we can't change the past. What we can do is learn from this." Critics weren't satisfied. Lawmakers began calling for reviews of family court policies, particularly in cases involving accusations of abuse or control. One senator took to the Senate floor, holding a copy of Katie's story in her hand. "This isn't just one family's tragedy," she said. "This is a failure of every safeguard we claim to have in place." Meanwhile, Katie herself remained far from the public eye. She had retreated into the safety of her adoptive parents' home, shielding her son from the relentless media coverage. But even there, she felt the weight of the systemic failings that had allowed Steven's actions to escalate. One evening, she sat with Kelly at the kitchen table, sorting through old letters and documents. Among them was a copy of Alyssa's initial police report, the one that had been dismissed. "They didn't care," Katie said, her voice shaking. "They didn't care until it was too late." Kelly reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on Katie's. "That's why people are speaking out now," she said, "so this doesn't happen to anyone else." But for Katie, the advocacy and promises of reform felt hollow. They couldn't undo the pain or the loss. They couldn't erase the memories of Steven's control or the lives he had destroyed. In the months that followed, several changes were enacted at the state and local levels. Policies were revised to ensure that reports of familial abuse were taken more seriously. Training programs for law enforcement were expanded to include education on coercive control and grooming behaviors. But for many, these changes felt like too little, too late. Katie watched the news one night as a headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen: "Legislation introduced to prevent future family tragedies." She turned off the TV with a sigh, her heart heavy. The system had been broken long before her story, and while there were signs of progress, she couldn't help but wonder how many more would suffer before real change took hold. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as Katie sat on the porch steps of her adoptive parents' home. Her son, now a toddler, played nearby, his laughter a bittersweet reminder of innocence untouched by the horrors she had endured. She smiled faintly, but her thoughts were far away, lost in the labyrinth of memories that haunted her. Kelly came outside carrying 2 cups of tea. She set one beside Katie before sitting down, her gaze soft and steady. "You've come so far," Kelly said after a moment. "I hope you know that." Katie wrapped her hands around the mug, the warmth grounding her. "It doesn't feel like it most days," she admitted. "Sometimes it feels like I'm just pretending to move on." Kelly didn't respond immediately, giving Katie the space to continue. "I keep thinking about everything that happened," Katie said, her voice trembling. "Not just Steven, but all of it. How it started, how it spiraled out of control. I keep asking myself what I could have done differently. Kelly placed a comforting hand on Katie's shoulder. You did what you could with what you knew at the time. None of this was your fault. Katie nodded, though the guilt clung to her like a shadow. I just wish I could go back, warn myself, stop it before it got so bad. The sound of her son's giggles drew her attention, and she watched as he toddled after a butterfly, his tiny feet stomping on the grass. He's the only good thing that came out of all this, Katie said softly. He's my reason to keep going. Kelly smiled, her eyes misting. He's lucky to have you. You're stronger than you realize, Katie. In the weeks following Steven's death, Katie had started therapy, a step she initially resisted, but now found invaluable. Her therapist encouraged her to confront her trauma, piece by piece, to unpack the layers of manipulation and control Steven had wielded over her. It was a painful process, but one that brought clarity and a sense of empowerment she hadn't felt in years. One evening, as she sorted through a box of old belongings, she came across a journal Alyssa had given her after Steven's arrest. Inside were entries Alyssa had written during the early days of Katie's reunion with the Pladls. The words were raw and unfiltered, a chronicle of Alyssa's growing fear and helplessness. I saw it happening, one entry read. I saw the way Steven looked at her, the way he talked about her, but no one believed me. They said I was imagining things, that I was just bitter from the divorce. I tried to warn Katie, but she didn't see it. Or maybe she couldn't. Katie closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. For so long, she had blamed Alyssa for not protecting her, for not stopping Steven sooner. But now she understood. Alyssa had fought for her in ways she hadn't fully appreciated. She had been another victim of Steven's manipulation, caught in a system that had failed them both. The next day, Katie decided to call Alyssa. It had been months since they last spoke, and the conversation was hesitant at first, filled with long pauses and unspoken regrets. But as they talked, something shifted. They began to share their pain, their anger, and their determination to move forward, not just for themselves, but for the child who connected them. We can't let what happened define us, Alyssa said toward the end of the call. We have to make something good come out of it. Katie agreed, though she wasn't sure what that would look like yet. All she knew was that she wasn't alone in this fight. Later that evening, as she tucked her son into bed, Katie felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in years. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "We're going to be okay." For the first time, she believed it. The sun hung low on the horizon as Katie stood in the backyard, watching her son chase a ball across the grass. His laughter was a melody she never tired of hearing, but today, her mind was elsewhere. The story of her life had been laid bare for the world to see, yet the lessons it carried seemed destined to be ignored by those who could have prevented it. Katie's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a notification about a news article. Another case had surfaced, eerily similar to hers. A young girl groomed by someone she trusted, manipulated into silence until the damage was irreversible. The headline felt like a dagger, reopening wounds that had only begun to heal. She turned off the screen and sat on the porch steps, her heart heavy. The systemic failures that allowed her tragedy to unfold were still present, still claiming new victims. Reports like hers often sparked outrage, temporary reforms, and impassioned debates, but real change remained elusive. Anthony came outside carrying a glass of water. He handed it to Katie and sat beside her, his gaze following her son as he played. "You're thinking about it again, aren't you?" he asked gently. Katie nodded. "It feels like nothing's changed. All the headlines, the interviews, the so-called reforms, they didn't stop this from happening again." Anthony sighed, his expression somber. "It's hard to change something so broken, but that doesn't mean your story didn't make a difference. You've shown people what happens when the warning signs are ignored. That's a start." Katie looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the rim of the glass. "It's not enough," she murmured. "People forget too quickly. They see these stories as tragedies, not warnings, and then it happens again." Later that evening, as she tucked her son into bed, Katie decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. Her therapist had encouraged her to find a way to reclaim her voice, to turn her pain into purpose. She opened her laptop and began drafting a letter, a message to lawmakers, to educators, to anyone who would listen. "I'm not just a survivor," she wrote. "I am a mother, a daughter, and a reminder of what happens when we fail to act. My story is not unique. It is one of many. And until we start listening, Until we take these signs seriously, it will not be the last." The words flowed from her like a flood, raw and unfiltered. When she finished, she stared at the screen, her chest tight with a mixture of fear and determination. This wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had been silenced, every child who might still be saved. The letter was published the following week, sparking a wave of renewed attention. Advocates rallied behind her, sharing her story as a call to action. Katie was invited to speak at events, to meet with policymakers, to give a voice to those who couldn't yet find their own. Still, progress was slow. For every step forward, there were setbacks. Bureaucratic delays, resistance to change, apathy. But Katie held on to the hope that even a small difference was worth fighting for. She couldn't undo the past, but she could fight for a future where fewer lives were broken by the same failures. On a warm spring morning, Katie stood on a stage in front of a small crowd, her son sitting in the front row. Her voice was steady as she shared her journey, her pain, and her hope. As she spoke, she saw faces in the audience light up with understanding, their eyes reflecting the urgency of her message. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. But it wasn't the sound that mattered. It was the quiet conversations that followed, the connections forged, the seeds of change being planted. As Katie walked off the stage, her son ran to her, wrapping his arms around her legs. "You did good, Mommy," he said with a smile. Katie knelt down, hugging him tightly. "Thank you, sweetheart. I did it for you." And for the first time, she felt the weight of her past begin to lift, replaced by the hope of a future where her story would not be repeated. What do you think of Steven Pladl and the tragic choices that led to this devastating outcome? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're captivated by true crime stories like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another gripping tale. Thank you for watching.